Welcome, everybody. Sorry for the little showing the wrong slides there for a moment. I'm Dean Taylor, Senior Policy Advisor with Plug in America. We're very excited to have you here today. We're a nonprofit, the voice of the EV consumer in Minnesota and nationwide. We have over 600 members in Minnesota, and we're one of the deepest pool of experienced EV drivers. We work on both policy and advocacy and education and outreach, including a Plug Star program with dealers, consumers, and utilities, and lead sponsors of National Drive Electric Week and Drive Electric Earth Day. Today, we have a really exciting agenda with our put together by our steering committee of Xcel Energy and Drive Electric Minnesota. We'll be covering basically legislation opportunities in 2022 for the state of Minnesota, with our lead speaker, Representative Jamie Long, who's elected in 2018 and is chair of the key committees for most of this legislation in the House. Corey Cantor with Bloomberg New Energy Finance has been an expert in this field for quite a while and will be giving us the big global picture on EVs. Jeremy Martin has been for several decades an expert on clean fuel standards, and we'll be talking about the Future Fuels Act legislation here in Minnesota, especially from the EV perspective. Deb Irwin will be talking about both last year's and this year's bill on before the legislature regarding clarifying and expanding the role for investor-owned utilities with electric vehicles. Brendan Jordan is going to be talking about the possibility of match funds for electric vehicles coming from the federal government with some of the new infrastructure bipartisan bill that recently passed. Rick Temption with the Alliance for Transportation Electrification was for over 30 years with Edison Electric Institute and now has his own consulting firm working on road tax, road fee issues, and we'll be talking about the possibility of doing a study bill in Minnesota. And then other legislation as part of like an omnibus bill will be talked about by Amber Backhouse, Vice President at the Minnesota Auto Dealers Association. We're recording this event and it will be posted later. And so the whole presentation will be there to have a chance to see it, and as well as more detailed bios will be posted. And our closing will be, we're very honored to have Senator David Senjem, who is chair of the key committees for most of the EV bills over in the Minnesota Senate. We're also excited to announce that we're planning to have another event later on, probably in March or April. It'll probably be 2 hours. We're going to be focusing on how to take advantage of the federal funds, not only for charging infrastructure, but for transit, school buses, and batteries. And we'll have some detailed panel discussions are planned there. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Representative Long, who we're very honored to have as our kickoff speaker. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks so much, Dean. Appreciate the invitation to be with everyone today to talk about one of my favorite topics, electric vehicles. We, I think, are seeing some incredible change in electric vehicles across the country and in Minnesota. I know we're going to get into that a little bit more, but a couple of my favorite stats. GM has said they're going all electric by 2035. Chrysler has said they're going all electric by 2028 now. And in Minnesota, we've also seen interest in EVs climb considerably and have in the last 4 years seen EV registrations climb by over 500%. So we know that there is growing interest in EV vehicles. We know that they are superior vehicles in terms of the cost of operation and the cost of maintenance. We also know that if you're looking at the life cycle cost for EVs right now, that they are competitive with even the vehicles that we might think of as affordable compact cars. So there's a lot to be excited about in the electric vehicle space, and we are certainly interested in Minnesota House and pushing forward on electric vehicle policy. So I'm just going to mention a few of the bills that might be coming up this session in the House and in the Climate and Energy Committee, and I think a number of those are going to get touched on in more detail by by speakers later in the presentation today. But last year we heard what I would consider a sort of omnibus electric vehicle bill, House File 1668, which was carried by my colleague Representative Zach Stevenson. That included a number of provisions to help improve the climate for electric vehicles. Those included some provisions to help dealers with making the transition, so some grants for training and for installation, which I know Amber is going to go into more detail about later. We also had some clarity for investor-owned utilities and for the roles that they can play in electric vehicle deployment. And we had some purchase preferences for electric vehicles for the Minnesota state fleet, so that we're leading the way as the state of Minnesota in electric vehicle deployment. So we'll certainly be bringing back many of those ideas this session. We also included the Future Fuels Act in our Energy Omnibus bill last year, and that's a technology neutral policy to move towards low carbon fuels. And we've seen in other states that have adopted this that has been a big boost to electrification fuels and to electrification infrastructure. So I think there will be a lot of discussion around that policy as well this session. We also had in the House Omnibus bill last year electric vehicle rebates. We know that that's the single most effective policy to help get electric vehicles deployed, and we know for a lot of emerging technologies, just as the cost curves are coming down, we've seen this with wind and solar, that a little bit of an additional help in the early stages of market deployment can go a long way to making sure that those technologies are widely adopted and the costs come down even more. So we've had a bill that would help consumers make up some of that initial price differential. And we also have been very focused on making sure that is widely shared for Minnesotans and targeted towards those who most need the help. So we've had a cap on the MSRP value for electric vehicles that could be eligible. And we also included a rebate for used vehicle markets so that we could make sure that we were getting access to folks who might not be able to afford a new vehicle, but could purchase one of the used electric vehicles, which are increasingly common on the market. So we have put together in the House a climate action plan, which totaled $1 billion over 5 different committees, and our commitments to taking action on climate change. And there was significant investment in electric infrastructure and electric vehicles in that plan. For the rebates, we included $15 million to help with getting the rebates launched over the next couple of years. We also have had some interest in our committee in thinking about new construction and how we might be able to get EV-ready buildings, particularly for multifamily housing and commercial buildings, where we know that those buildings have very long lives, and if we're not thinking about the ability for charging electric vehicles now, then it could be a lot more costly down the road to go back in and retrofit. So we're trying to take a look at that policy as well and see if there might be some appetite for moving forward on a building policy this year. And then we importantly are going to be spending a lot of time, I think, talking about charging infrastructure, and there's going to be some federal funds, I think, coming down the pike that can help out with electric vehicle infrastructure deployment. But we know that we are, I think, pretty far behind in Minnesota in terms of getting our EV infrastructure built out across the state. It's still one of the main things I hear about from some of my colleagues, particularly in greater Minnesota, as well. I don't even know where the charging infrastructure is near me. And so we need to make sure that we're reducing that range anxiety and trying to help folks around the state have access to charging infrastructure wherever they go. So we included in our proposal, our House Minnesota Climate Action Plan, $30 million for electric vehicle charging infrastructure deployment as well. And I know the governor also had a large proposal in his budget for electric vehicle infrastructure. So I'll stop there, and I'm certainly looking forward to hearing more detail from everybody on the exciting proposals that we have coming up today. But We're going to have, I think, another electric vehicle hearing day in the Minnesota House Climate Committee. So stay tuned. We'll keep you posted on that, and looking forward to the discussion today.
Well, that's very exciting. Thank you, Representative Long. Just a quick reminder, put your questions into the Q&A. We should have about 5 minutes at the end for that, rather than using the chat function. Our next speaker is Corey Cantor, who'll be, like I said before, giving us the big picture on the global opportunity.
Great, and Dean, you can see my screen, right?
I can, and it looks full screen to me.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Well, thank you for having me this morning. It's great to get the opportunity to speak to everyone about the state of the EV industry. I'm going to be talking mostly about the global level, but I think it should be helpful for folks in Minnesota thinking about where to go next and where the industry is going. So just to kind of look back and look at the kind of moment that we're sitting in, news on the EV transition is seeming to happen just about every single day, whether it's GM unveiling their Equinox EV coming out next year, Chrysler, as stated previously, going fully electric by 2028, Renault, Nissan, and Mitsubishi unveiling their EV plans, and Tesla running one of the most productive auto factories in America. You really can't go a moment without reading more about electric vehicles, and I believe this is going to pick up even quicker in the years ahead and the weeks ahead. We are on the cusp of a major shift in the EV industry. So if you look at global sales in 2012, about 10 years ago, about 100,000 units sold. In 2015, we hit about 400,000 EVs sold globally. And as you can see here, North America and the US particularly, and Europe were seen as leading regions. Fast forward to the late 2010s, and you begin to see China take a leading role in the electric vehicle space. Now, you might notice in particular that the US EV sales, after growing quite a bit between 2015 and 2018, begins to stagnate. Globally, though, things change. We go from about 1.1 million units sold in 2017 to 2.1 in 2019. And then even during a global pandemic, electric vehicle sales grew to more than 3 million units sold. Notice again that Europe, thanks to strong fuel economy policies, and China are making up the vast majority of the market. And again, the US stagnates. Despite the pandemic, though, EV sales did not move backwards. And then in 2021, EV sales globally hit greater than 6.6 million units. So that's more than 6 times the 2017 final sales numbers. And there is some good news for the US as it pertains to 2021. EV sales went from about 325,000 in 2020 to about 652,000 in our preliminary numbers, meaning that the overall market just about doubled. Again, most of that, about 45 to 50% happening in California, but it just shows that the industry may have very well reached that kind of tipping point, and we'll begin to see growth in years ahead. One final note on kind of the US numbers, ultimately, you're only hitting about 4.4% of total passenger vehicle sales, so there still is a long way to go. Here's the same global chart by drivetrain. You'll notice that plug-in hybrid electric vehicles are continuing to be a big part of the story, but battery electric vehicles are making up a greater portion of the whole. Next year, Bloomberg NEF projects about 10.5 million electric vehicles sold, and in the US, about 1.2 million EVs. So again, almost double from this past year. In addition, public EV charging connectors are on the rise. So in 2020, we had about 1.3 million charging connectors, up to 1.8. A lot of this is being done in China. So again, the US has a bit of a ways to go. As it pertains to the US, the major drivers of adoption have been purchase subsidies, fuel economy standards, and in the long term, 2-car home ownership. We're still debating and seeing where the kind of federal subsidies will be. Fuel economy, Biden's rules are going into effect, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And 2-car home ownership, we see as a long-term strength of this market, given that folks can transition one car over to electric, see how they like it, and then if they do, transition the other car over. Now, US federal EV policy may undergo some large changes, I'm sure as many of you know. President Biden announced updates to fuel economy standards, which we've done modeling on and we think will have a strong impact on the market. In addition, you've got that $7.5 billion in charging, billions of dollars towards electric transit and school buses. The key part, though, is that Build Back Better Act still has failed to pass. And what that means is that in the years ahead, EV subsidies may lessen without kind of that policy change. All the forecasts I'm going to show you were published last June, so none of these policies are taken into account. But just to show you what impact the fuel economy standards could have, this is separate from our long-term outlook. This is just some of our kind of scenario managing that we did in a separate research note. We find that EV share of sale under Biden's fuel economy standards in the proposed rule by DOT would hit about 24% EV share of sale. What this means is that we expect for automakers to have to ship more EVs to the US overall, starting in about 2024 to avoid massive fines. Nevertheless, it's still behind the kind of overall EV fleet under the Obama era original targets, though it's ahead of the Trump era safe rule. So that, again, is kind of a look at the EV policy. The last thing I want to just talk about is our long-term outlook. This is based on just the market fundamentals, and we put it out once a year in June. It's called our long-term electric vehicle outlook. And it's driven by this idea that battery costs have fallen. A supply chain spike could further delay an upfront price parity moment, but nevertheless, we think the world is moving towards electric vehicles and that kind of key point of $100 per kilowatt hour. As a result, we expect the global EV fleet to continue to expand to hit over 50 million units by 2025. Again, China and Europe making up the vast majority of the market, with the US only beginning to grow towards mid-decade. Electric buses and commercial vehicles on the rise as well. And then in China and Southeast Asia in particular, electric 2- and 3-wheelers. Now, globally, we expect passenger EV sales to rise to about 66 million units, while reaching about 68% of global new sales in 2040. And again, you could see the US lagging, Europe and China under our expectations, which means there's a lot of work to do. And Canada has some long-term targets as well that we think will drive their fundamentals strong. Nevertheless, we expect the US and South Korea to end above the global average by 2040, and the other countries beginning in the kind of late 2020s to 2030s to see their EV adoption rate increase. And globally, the passenger EV fleet will hit about 618 million vehicles by 2040. And it's not just BNF that has seen this higher EV fleet in the future. Both us, OPEC, and IEA still all believe that hundreds of millions of EVs are going to be on the roads by 2030 and 2040, although we are a more bullish long-term view. Now to kind of finish up, it's important to remind everyone that that is kind of a market-driven forecast. But in addition, there are tons of targets globally and within the United States of phasing out the sales of vehicles with internal combustion engine. In terms of US states, the main ones are really just New York, California, and Massachusetts, but we expect more to be moving up on the way. And automakers are devoting more and more CapEx and R&D towards electric vehicles.
Something went wrong.
Excuse me. To finalize, we have a ton of automakers who are looking at EV targets in the future and have their own ICE phase outs. So not just GM and not just Chrysler, but in addition, we have those who are ending ICE vehicle investment. So as a whole, the kind of big picture here is both policymakers and automakers are moving towards this all electric future. The question is, what states and regions is it going to be in here in the US, and what can policymakers do to kind of set the stage for it, or risk potentially falling further behind Europe and China in the decades ahead?
Thank you so much, Corey. That's an awesome presentation. Our next speaker is Jeremy Martin, who will be speaking about the Future Fuels Act in Minnesota. Jeremy, can you go ahead and share your slides? Perfect. Thank you. Welcome.
Great. Can you hear me? And
yes.
See my slide? Excellent. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the Future Fuels Act and how it supports transportation electrification in particular. My name is Jeremy Martin at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and I work on fuels policy, which I've been doing for a while, and have a bunch of relevant things that you might want to look at. I'll have links on the last slide to some reports and fact sheets covering different elements I'll draw from very briefly today, just to give you kind of a high-level overview. And so today I'm going to focus on the Future Fuels Act, which was a bill last year in both chambers. I've got the bill numbers and authors, many of whom are with us today, listed here. So, and if the Future Fuels Act is a Minnesota version of what a number of other states have done or are looking at doing, which is, which I think we can call a clean fuel standard. And so the idea with a clean fuel standard is, so I'm just going to explain clean fuel standards in general, and particularly how they focus on how they support electrification. So here we go. So one of the core concepts behind a clean fuel standard or the Future Fuels Act is that when we want to compare fuels as dissimilar as gasoline, ethanol, or electricity, or all the other transportation fuels, we really need to think about not just tailpipe pollution, but the full life cycle pollution. So for gasoline, that's extracting, refining, and using the fuel. For ethanol, obviously a lot of factors, and for electricity, different utilities will have different carbon intensities depending on their mix of generating sources. And of course, as we get to higher and higher penetration of renewables, we can bring down this carbon intensity for transportation by 90%. So this is a score we assign to fuels. And the idea with a clean fuel standard is to require that all the fuel that's sold gets steadily cleaner over time. And so we set a standard where, compared to the baseline, the fuels sold in a jurisdiction, in the state of Minnesota, for example, have to get steadily cleaner over time. And so all these fuels are different. And one of the, and so fuels that are more polluting than the standard generate deficits. Fuels which are cleaner than the standard generate credits. And so if you want to sell gasoline in a state with a regulation like this, then you need to come into compliance with the rules by either changing the fuel you're selling, for example, blending ethanol into gasoline or biodiesel or renewable diesel into diesel. And when you're doing that, one of the key elements here is that you're going to look for the cleanest fuels to blend and sell, and you're going to place a higher value on cleaner fuels because they'll generate more credits. They'll help you comply with this policy. So that really means that cleaner fuels become more valuable, and that really is a market driver for development of clean fuels. So on the electricity side, we've got these credits, and so obviously you can't easily blend electricity with gasoline, and so in that instance, what happens is that somebody who's selling gasoline would buy credits from somebody who's using electricity to power an electric vehicle. And that's sort of the mechanism through which a clean fuel standard like the Future Fuels Act supports transportation electrification in the abstract. So if we go look at a particular, the state of California has had a similar policy in effect for 10 years. And so if we look briefly at the history there, on the left, we've got a chart of sort of the quantities of alternative fuels used in the state of California over this last decade when that policy's been in effect. And what you see, there's been a big increase in the use of these alternative and low carbon fuels. But on the right, we have not the quantity of the fuel, but the quantity of the emission reductions, because this is a policy which is not promoting the use of a quantity of fuel, it's promoting cutting emissions. And what you can see here is that, for example, the green bars at the top of the chart represent electricity, and the green bars on the right for the emissions benefits are larger than the green bars on the left, which is sort of just the share of fuel in gallons of gasoline equivalent. And that's because electricity is a very low carbon fuel, and so it generates a lot of credits. And so those credits then mean dollars, right? And so if we just look at those credits that were generated by electric vehicles in California in 2020, that was 2.9 million credits, and there was an average market price in that year for the credits of $198 per metric ton of emissions. And so that added up to $580 million generated to support electric vehicles in California in 2020. So that's, California is a big state, but that's a big chunk of change to really help drive transportation electrification. So how does that play out in reality? Where does that money go and how is it used? So one important thing is, so if you're running a big fleet, so if you're a transit agency, for example, and you're starting to introduce electric buses, an electric bus would generate credits worth something like $10,000 or more every year. So that's a very material impact on the cost of ownership and operations for the electric bus, and really make sure that transit agencies can go electric quickly. So the LCFS really supports transportation electrification, and it's allowed, for example, California to, be pretty aggressive in setting standards for transit electrification, because they know they've got this other source of support to make sure the economics work for the agencies. But what about residential EV charging? So that's different. We don't have every driver in California is not registering with the state to participate in this policy. Instead, the states are taking a different approach there. And so California has taken a different approach than Oregon, and Minnesota can innovate in this area to make sure what they do works best for them. So just very briefly, the largest thing that California has done with the residential charging credits is the utilities have pooled them to create a cash on the hood EV incentive program to support EV sales. And they're also setting aside some of those funds to support transportation electrification projects in disadvantaged communities in programs run by the utilities. Oregon has taken a different approach. Their policy is called the Clean Fuel Program. And so in that state, these two major utilities have used these funds from the Clean Fuel Program to run a variety of grant programs and other EV incentive projects. These are kind of the top line budget items that they've been using. And so you see they've been supporting electric school buses. They've been supporting grants to community groups to get electric vehicles, to help with public infrastructure and other things. So those are what California and Oregon has done. Of course, Minnesota's got a different landscape, different needs. And so, as the policy, the Future Fuels Act is developed in legislation and ultimately even more so, I think, in the regulatory process, there's an opportunity to direct those funds in ways that really work for Minnesota drivers and to advance transportation electrification in Minnesota. So that's what I've got. Here are some links to some resources with more information and my contact information. And I know we're going quickly through our agenda, so I'll turn it back over to the next speaker.
Great, thank you so much, Jeremy. That was great. Our next speaker is Deb Irwin from Xcel Energy, speaking on the utility bill this year in the session.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about one of the bills that Representative Long mentioned earlier. It was that House number 1668, Senate 1684. And we do have a new version that I think we'd like folks support on as well. So, basically there is a need for legislation to establish a really robust foundation for utility support of transportation electrification. I think folks probably realize that as the utility grid decarbonizes, it presents that really great opportunity to bring the benefits of that decarbonization to the transportation sector. And so, Xcel Energy, along with other utilities, have been proposing programs and initiatives to support our customers on this electrification journey. But to date, those programs have really been more of a pilot scale initiative. And so, with that, I think the commission really needs some more foundation on which to stand to be able to support a more robust utility role. And so that's really what the bill would do. It's what we call foundational legislation for transportation electrification plans for utilities. And what we're really trying to do is create that more robust framework. So more clarity on the types of things that utilities would be expected to address, really wanting to be clear that utilities should be encouraged to come forward with the things that we're hearing from our customers, that we're hearing from stakeholders, and that this is appropriate and this is something that we want to make sure we support as a state. To be a little bit more specific, right, that includes supporting all types of customers, all types of infrastructure, not just light duty vehicles, but medium and heavy duty electrification needs, all types of electric mobility solutions, including those that make sure we're supporting low and moderate income customers. And so really moving from this kind of piloting phase that we've been in, I think, as a state, and getting to that point where we can really accelerate the delivery of the benefits of transportation electrification. And For electric utilities that are regulated, that all needs to be done through the Public Utilities Commission. And so we think this bill will really create what is a needed, strong foundation for utility support. And so we're looking forward to working with all of you to get it supported throughout the legislative session this year. I think the one thing I'll also note, and maybe Amber will talk about this as well, for Xcel Energy, we also have, folks may be familiar with a renewable development account fund. And we're looking to include a provision that would support make-ready infrastructure for some of those customers that haven't been eligible to participate in the programs that we've done to date. And so we're hoping to use this as a great opportunity to leverage, with Minnesota's clean energy leadership, the leadership of utilities like Xcel Energy, to really bring the benefits that we can and make sure that we're reaching the needs of all customers, all types of transportation, and doing it across the board. And I'll leave it there because I know we're running short on time, Dean. Thanks.
Wow, that was awesome. Thank you for helping us catch up. Our next speaker is Brendan Jordan. Appreciate that.
Hi, everybody. This is Brendan Jordan. I'm at the Great Plains Institute, and I serve as a facilitator for Drive Electric Minnesota. I'm going to similarly try to keep my remarks brief to try to preserve some time for Q&A and discussion. But one of the things I wanted to highlight was we know there's a lot of opportunities for federal funding. And so the big question is, how do we as a state respond to new federal funding? What is the state role in relation to that federal funding? So starting with a high level overview, and I'm going to skip slides just to save time and just provide this verbally, but we know there is significant funding available at the federal level. There's about close to $8 billion available for zero emission vehicles generally. And a variety of additional sources of funding available for the electric grid and batteries, which can be relevant to electric vehicles and clean vehicles more generally. And that funding covers a few different areas. One of the areas is electric vehicle infrastructure. Minnesota is going to receive some funding for electric vehicle infrastructure on a formula basis. But there's additional funding that could be available on a discretionary basis. So I think as a state, we want to be prepared to compete for additional funding beyond what's automatically available. There's additional sources of funding related to buses, so potential interest in electric transit and electric school buses. I did see one comment on the topic of electric school buses, and that is an opportunity for additional funding. There's also funding in areas like electric vehicle manufacturing, battery manufacturing, and battery recycling. And generally speaking, most of those other sources of funding would be discretionary or competitive. We would be competing with other states for that funding. A lot of those federal funding priorities do align with state priorities. Drive Electric Minnesota has been very consistent in supporting additional funding for infrastructure. We also support some things that aren't available through the federal funding, like purchase incentives. But there's some alignment with Drive Electric Minnesota's priorities around bus electrification. But I think that the high level question here is, why not just, well, we've got all this federal funding, we don't need to do anything as a state, right? And I would argue there's a few reasons not to simply rely on federal funding. Number one, we as a state should be developing our own priorities. And in some cases, there's going to be a need to fund things that the federal government doesn't fund. So having a robust state policy is really crucial. I think in some cases, we should be thinking about leverage. We may receive federal funding in a certain area, but we could make that funding go further. There's been a lot of analysis, for example, around the EV charging gap and the level of EV charging we will need to catch up with expected levels of EV adoption. Even with a greatly increased federal investment, that's not going to be enough by itself. The other thing to point out is, the federal funding may not provide sufficient funding in every area. There may be areas where funding is not provided. I think some of the questions for us as a state are, is there enough funding in rural areas? Is there enough funding for EV charging in communities that want to make sure and provide funding, for example, for people living in multi-unit dwellings, or people who may not have a parking structure to charge their vehicle, making sure that we have an equitable approach that provides charging in all communities. And so for all those reasons, I think it is really important for Minnesota to consider making some of our own investments. Drive Electric Minnesota would love to see us, particularly in the infrastructure area, but in other areas, get ready to really understand the gaps and what the federal funding doesn't cover, and make sure that we're ready, for all those reasons, to really compete effectively for additional funding and make sure that we meet our own needs as a state. I'll leave it there and pass it on to the next speaker, and happy to take questions, time permitting.
Perfect. Our next speaker is Rick Tempshin with the Alliance for TE. We'll be talking about the issue of EVs and road taxes.
Great. Thanks, Dean. Appreciate you having me today. Welcome, everyone. We took a look, we did a study with support from the Atlas Public Policy, their highway revenue assessment tool, to look at road funding and the impact of electric vehicle commercialization on funding going forward. Corey talked about the projections of sales of electric vehicles. It's very ambitious, and we expect electric vehicle sales to grow quickly, but that's from a very small base, actually a zero base, right? So the question is really, what is the impact of electric vehicle commercialization on Minnesota's highway funding, and the gap there that the state of Minnesota has? And by the way, we feel that EV owners should pay their fair share of the use of the roads, and I'll get into a little bit of detail on that. So with that, one of the key findings is that, no surprise, fuel economy improvements drive the funding gap. We found that there's a $91 million decline in funding through 2030 due to fuel economy. All cars get more efficient over time, no surprise there. And then we have the new CAFE standards that have just been announced that will further erode revenue. So that number 91 million is very conservative. Next slide, please. We also found that inflation will contribute to the losses of purchasing power. No surprise there, but we quantified that. We know that construction and maintenance costs will rise. And it looks like Minnesota is set to lose $171 million in purchasing power due to inflation through 2030. So that's the other big chunk of money there. And Minnesota has studied this in the past, and there's no surprises there, but we just want to highlight this and make sure everybody is on the same page. Now, in terms of electric vehicles paying their fair share, there's always a question about what's fair, what's equitable, what's equivalent, what's comparable. We find that the current $75 registration tax on electric vehicles, an annual tax on electric vehicles in Minnesota, is fair and equitable. And the way we like to look at it is that EVs are very high miles per gallon vehicle, over 100 miles per gallon on average. And higher taxes on EVs will penalize fuel efficiency. In this country, we've provided an incentive for fuel efficiency. People pay less at the pump for gasoline, they pay fewer taxes for a more efficient vehicle, which is very equitable and fair way to do that. We reward fuel efficiency. So next slide, please, just to give you an illustration of what that means. So here we go. A 2010 Ford F-150 truck on average would pay $216 a year. A new Ford F-150 truck on average would pay $167 a year. Now the new Ford F-150 Lightning truck at 85 miles a gallon would, to be fair and equitable, should pay $43 a year. They will pay $75 a year as it stands now. So we could argue that currently Minnesotans pay more than their fair share. Electric vehicle owners in Minnesota pay more than their fair share if we just look at it the same way we're looking at the way we tax in Minnesota, state taxes, the way we tax gasoline vehicles. So let me just leave that up there for a minute, because this is something that people don't really have a real good grasp on. Again, electric vehicles are very highly energy efficient. This one is 85 miles a gallon. Most are over 100 miles a gallon on average. Next slide, please. So another key finding is that if we raise that $75 tax that's currently in place in Minnesota, will have a negligible impact on revenues. Again, it's going from a very small base. Percentage of EVs on the road will be small, will continue to be small in terms of compared to the number of total vehicles on the road, and anything higher than $75 is punitive and will have a negative impact on EV sales. And also, just in terms of the user pays principle of taxation. In other words, the person who benefits pays a flat tax, a $75 tax, a flat annual tax on vehicles is counter to that principle. So it's just bad policy in our estimation. Next slide, please. And here's just an illustration of what I just mentioned, giving you some of the numbers in an illustrative way. Fuel economy is by far, fuel economy of all vehicles, all new vehicles, is by far the biggest impact on revenues at the pump. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. So, and happy to take some questions later. Minnesota needs to figure out how to fill the gap. And there are ways to do that. There are many ways to do that. The Association of State Highway Officials, National Association, has a list of about 40 different ways that states can fill the gap. But here's some of the highlights of the ones that have been used in Minnesota or have been talked about most recently. Increase in general funds, public-private partnership, raising the motor fuel tax, or indexing it to inflation would take care of the inflation issue. And also road user charges. Minnesota has studied this in the past, and they're engaged in a new study with partnering with the state of Kansas to look at road user charges. Just to pause on that for a minute. This is something that has gotten a lot of attention over the years. Many states, 14 states, are looking at it. In the infrastructure bill, the federal infrastructure bill allocates $125 million towards the study of road user charges going to the states and local government. So road user charges, where you get charged per mile, for example, is certainly an equitable way to do that. It's a little bit complicated, a little bit challenging, which is why it's taking a lot of research to look at that. But most folks feel like that is the direction we're going, and Minnesota is certainly engaged in that research and expects to look deeply into that. So with that, I'll pass it back on to Dean and happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Rick. It's a very interesting presentation. Our next speaker is Amber from the Minnesota Automobile Dealers Association.
Great, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And Dean, I think I'm just going to hold off on my slides because they're more background that can be shared with the group after the fact. But again, Amber Backus with the Minnesota Automobile Dealers Association, and really grateful for the host for putting on this presentation and the ability to share the dealership's perspective on how to accelerate the transition to electric vehicles. Before getting into some of the specific policies that are being considered at the Capitol, I'd like to provide a bit of background. Our 350 new car member dealerships are not owned by the manufacturers. They are independent franchise businesses, many of them family owned and operating in their communities for decades. As a franchisee of the manufacturers, dealers are contractually obligated to meet certain brand standards, and they are not given inventory from the manufacturers or take it on consignment. Dealers purchase their inventory from the manufacturers outright. This is a highly intensive capital business, and our dealers are judicious about the investments they make so they can continue to be successful and pass the business on to the next generation. I just share this to give some context as we transition to electric vehicles. Dealers are all in on selling and servicing them and will be essential to their deployment since there are almost 5 million passenger vehicles on the road in Minnesota and less than 0.5% are EVs. But the timeline for each dealership to be EV ready varies based on economic and market factors. Primarily, what are the upfront costs that the manufacturers require a dealership to make before it is eligible to sell EVs? And how quickly can the dealer recoup their investment after they've chosen to become EV certified? With regard to the upfront cost, for the first generation electric vehicles like a Chevy Volt, a dealer's cost to become EV certified were around $15,000 to $25,000. With bigger electric vehicles and higher capacity batteries coming, the number has increased tenfold for some makes, with dealers required to make investments of $150,000 to $200,000. Manufacturers are requiring dealerships to have more expensive level 3 chargers, more of them, and larger lifts and higher cost repair equipment if they are going to sell EVs. In an industry with low profit margins of historically about 3%, dealers are only going to make this investment if they have the resources and are confident they can get a return on that investment. How quickly a dealer can recoup their investments will be based on how soon EV product comes to market and whether those vehicles are embraced by consumers. There is so much uncertainty in the marketplace right now, especially due to the supply chain issues, that it's more of a gamble for dealers to make such a large capital investment not knowing when the payoff will come. Recently, Ford has had to delay production of the Mach-E due to the microchip shortage, and the release of its highly anticipated F-150 Lightning could also be impacted. But beyond these lags and the electric vehicles coming to market, the product itself really matters. A vehicle's upfront cost and its utility are the two top factors that influence what vehicle a consumer purchases. With EVs costing on average $12,000 more than the comparable gas-powered vehicle, the higher price is a deterrent to getting consumers to buy them. And because the truck segment, including pickups, SUVs, and crossovers, has been underrepresented in the EV space, Minnesotans have been less likely to opt for an EV. For the past 2 years, trucks have accounted for 87% of Minnesota's new passenger vehicle sales, with the Chevy Silverado and Ford F-150 consistently the top 2 selling vehicles in the state. Without an EV pickup in the marketplace and non-luxury SUV and crossover options extremely limited, some Minnesota dealers have delayed investing in EV infrastructure. Case in point, Chevy has the most franchise dealerships in the state, but with Bolt as the only EV offering, just 40% of its Minnesota dealers have become EV certified. But fortunately, that's changing, and with Chevy's announcement of an electric Silverado and other manufacturers bringing the first EV pickup trucks to market this year and other SUVs, which will really help satisfy Minnesota consumer demand for pickups and SUVs. But there is still that issue of cost and that disparity between EVs and the comparable gas-powered vehicle. And this is really where the state can help. We are so grateful to Representative Stevenson and Chairs Long and Senjum for championing bills, House File 1668 and Senate File 1684, already identified by Chair Long and mentioned by Debit Excel. Besides the charging pieces in those bills, those are the bills that also include grants to dealerships to offset the cost of becoming EV certified and consumer incentives to reduce that disparity in the upfront cost of EVs. We think, along with our cohorts and Drive Electric Minnesota and other supporters that these initiatives will increase the number of EVs in the marketplace and spur demand. Section 7 of the bill is where the grant program for dealerships is established and would allow dealers to apply for grants of up to $40,000 to help them become EV ready and meet the manufacturer's requirements. These dollars will go a long way in alleviating some of the financial risks dealers are required to make, and could also help offset any surprise charges that arise if a dealership finds out it needs to upgrade its electricity infrastructure in order to install DC charging stations, which has been the experience of a few of our members. And additionally, since dealerships are located on high traffic corridors in all corners of the state, more EV certified dealers means more access to vehicle charging stations for the motoring public as they traverse Minnesota. But as Chair Long alluded to, the real game changer is Section 6 of the bill, which provides consumer rebates for purchase of electric vehicles. Again, with EVs costing on average $12,000 more than the comparable conventional vehicle, that upfront cost of ownership is a deterrent. But research and the success of rebate programs in other states show that financial incentives are the most efficient and effective means to getting EVs on the road. The Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, in its 2019 report entitled Accelerating Electric Vehicle Adoption, identifies incentives as the most important factor in EV adoption. The National Association of State Energy Officials agrees with this assessment after compiling a policy matrix that finds vehicle purchase programs the most effective way to get more EVs on the road. And the experience of states with robust incentives to reduce the upfront cost of EVs has also borne this out. Georgia had a $5,000 EV tax credit on the books, but when it was repealed in 2015, EV sales dropped 90% in 1 year. Other states that have instituted similar tax credits or rebates as proposed in House File 1668 and Senate File 1684 have seen sales of EVs increase by 2 to 4 times the national average. This approach is overwhelmingly supported by Minnesotans. Over 70% of both Democrats and Republicans thinks that this will help drive demand for the market, bringing more EV options and leading to lower vehicle costs. And I just also have to mention that as Minnesota has a record $7.7 billion surplus, we think this is the perfect time to authorize dealer grants and consumer rebates. So it'd be a great use of one-time money to charge the transition to EVs. And with that, I'll conclude my remarks and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Amber. That was an awesome presentation. I'm going to go to Q&A. We have time for maybe a couple quick questions. One I see in the chat or in the Q&A section is, what can state legislators do to accelerate the transition to electric school buses? So maybe Chair Long or Brendan, Jordan, maybe you can answer that.
Sure, we've had funding for electric school buses in our House Energy Omnibus packages before, and are certainly interested in doing more there as well. We've also included funding for Met Transit to purchase electric buses, and we're interested in pursuing both of those. Electric transit buses right now are a little bit more cost competitive than electric school buses, so I think we only have maybe 2 at this point electric school buses in the state. So we're certainly looking to do more there, and I believe Excel has got some partnerships on the electric school bus front. So I don't know if Deborah wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, thanks. I did throw a little bit of it in the chat, but we do have both a pilot demonstration that we'll be working on for some vehicle to grid capabilities for school buses, and also have a pending proposal at the Public Utilities Commission to support rebates to address that upfront cost for electric school bus purchases. So hopeful that we can do what needs to be done to address some of those upfront cost barriers.
Our next webinar that we hope to do in a month or 2 is on the federal funds, and that there's $6 billion for electric school buses. We're going to have a speaker on that topic, how Minnesota could be more competitive compared to other states going after that. Another really quick, maybe our last question here before we go to Senator Senjem, what steps can be taken to improve charging station reliability after installation, particularly as funding grows? Drivers can have significant problems using chargers due to hardware problems, cell coverage, for using required apps, software connectivity issues, etc. Does anybody want to take a stab at the reliability question?
Well, I'll just say, obviously, that is critical importance. And I think really some of that comes down to contracting and, you know, when public funding gets issued, to make sure that there are reliability and uptime requirements built into those contracts.
Great. We're about 3 minutes to go. I want to turn it over to Senator Senjum with any kind of closing thoughts that he has after hearing everything that has happened today. If you could go off mute, Senator. On the far.
I'm sorry. Okay, there we are.
There you go.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Plug-in America, and all involved in this. Very interesting. I often say the role of legislator is to see the future and go there. And certainly, as we look at the transition of our passenger vehicles and other forms of transportation, the future is electrification. We will go there. I know that we'll be active in the Senate. It was the bills were mentioned in terms of dealership and rebates and things like that. I've got that bill in the Senate. We'll certainly play it. I think charging stations will be a big point of discussion in the Senate, and I think we'll do something in that area. Range anxiety is real. Cold climate anxiety relative to EV vehicles, I think it's still out there, and I think is factual. We all know that, it's just chemistry. But beyond that, I know Senator Newman's working on this whole question about the Highway Trust Fund and the gas tax versus the electrical vehicle, and how we create equity there, and what that formula might be. I frankly personally favor just a sales tax approach to highway construction and so on and so forth. I think it's fair and more broadly applied, but he's looking at that, and that will be a point of our conversations in the legislature this year. But I often think, for most people, if it's not the next car they buy, it's the car after that will be electric. And our state is, like any other state, needs to be prepared for that for all the right reasons, whether it's decarbonization or whatever it might be. But that's the trend, and that's where we're going. And I appreciate everybody in this audience today, particularly the speakers who lent their commentary towards this journey that we're on. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Senjum. That's awesome. I just want to remind everybody, we will have recorded this workshop and be posting this. Give us a few days to have it at Plug-in America. Probably could just do a Google search, Plug-in America Minnesota, and be able to find this presentation. In addition, together with several other partners, we've done a detailed policy toolkit called the Achieve Policy Toolkit, which is way into the weeds of all the different things that a state can do. So that's another useful thing that you can find at the Plug-in America website, called the Achieve Policy Toolkit. And with that, I'm going to close out. Apologize, we couldn't answer all the questions in the chat, but we look forward to a very exciting 2022 in Minnesota. Thank you, everyone. Thanks all to the speakers. Thanks to some of our partners, like I should call out Bill Black and Yuka, for getting some of the word out to some of the others speakers. I appreciate that very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.